It's no secret that as this pandemic has gone on, financial situations for people all around the world have become increasingly more difficult, while the elite or the rich just seem to be getting richer. And, in financial crisis, we always start talking about, the discussions of how can we raise minimum wage or create more jobs. But perhaps there's something even deeper that we need to look at. Perhaps to get to a solution, we have to understand what the problem truly is. So here this week on the Setty Report, we're going to be diving into kind of what that problem is and how this leads to a conversation about the solution. Madhava, welcome to your report here. Why don't you start by taking us through some of how this system, this monetary system works, so we can understand how we lead towards a conversation about the solution.
What I'm going to talk about today is rather dry. It's about money, it's about finance and things like that. But look, that's the price you got to pay to get to the bottom of things. I like your lead up. This is more than a crisis of medicine. It's a crisis of finance, and I would say more people have suffered from the pandemic financially than medically. So that's why this is really, really relevant. And I'm going to move through it quickly. And there's some real nuggets at the end of this, so stay with me here. The first thing I'd like to talk about here is a basic idea that we have, which is that prices tend to go up. Why? Why do prices go up? That's a really interesting question to ask oneself. And hopefully, from basic economic theory, we understand that the price of something is based on the supply and the demand of it, right? The more demand, the more suppliers can charge for it. The harder it is to create, the more people, the more they can charge for it, or the more they're required to charge for it. But let's just assume that supply and demand were, relatively quiescent. They're at where they are. Do prices go up? Yes, they do. Why is that? This has to do with the supply of money itself. And that's what I want to focus in on. Key point number one. The price of things is greatly dependent upon the supply of money. To demonstrate that, let's take a look at this graph right here. This is the supply of money over time. Notice that it is skyrocketing, right? This particular graph just goes back into, around 1957 or something like that. And here we are at 2020. And it's grown by at least a factor of like 40 or 50, perhaps even more than that. Now, let us look at a graph of how prices have grown. This one is called cumulative inflation. Inflation is the growth of prices. And we start here at 1913, which is a very key date to most of you out there who are educated about the financial system. 1913 was very important. But notice here that the inflation, or the relative price of goods, has gone up by a factor of 26, which means a dollar today would have been worth about 3.5 cents back in 1913. So we see this relationship holds, and it makes sense. So we tend to call this, we use the word inflation all the time. The things aren't really inflating. Inflation, obviously, there's a price increase. But what is really happening, and this is why it's important to challenge the word inflation, is that the mechanism is not the spontaneous growth of prices. It is actually the growth of the money supply. So what we can actually say here is that the money that we use is being devalued. It's being devalued because there's more money entering the circulation that we use to exchange value. How does that happen? Very important question. This goes back to the year 1913. This is when an institution that we call the Federal Reserve, at least in the United States, was brought into existence by an act of Congress. Now, the Federal Reserve is just one example of what is generally known as a central bank. The difference between a bank and a central bank, I hope we understand this, is that a central bank controls the supply of money in a country. How do they do that? How can they actually control, how much money is in the system? The increase in the monetary supply has to do with something that we like to call credit. So what we want to point out here is that they're just not dumping money, they're not printing money and dumping it into the economy. The monetary supply grows every time a government decides that they are spending more than they're collecting. And for example, in the pandemic, people in this country, the United States, got, what I would consider very meager support over the last 15 months in the form of relief checks. Where did the money come from? It didn't come from taxes, because these are the people, you can't tax the people that you're trying to support. There isn't some large donor someplace that said, let's go help the people. What they're doing, we like to say that they're printing money, but that's not really what's happening. When a relief check or an expenditure that exceeds the income of a government is made, those numbers are just being typed into accounts. A governmental account, or in the situation that we're in right now with the relief checks, they appear in your account or as a piece of paper, but someone types in a number. So there's no actual printing of money in a press. These numbers, this money just appears. So wherever debt is being taken, money is entering the system. So that means we are contributing to the expansion of the monetary supply every time we take a car loan, get a mortgage, an educational loan. We are increasing the amount of money in circulation. Now we're faced with a problem, right? Because how do we pay for these things that we can't afford if we don't have the ability to take loans? This is why it's very difficult. But what I would like to introduce to you is the idea that the reason why those things are so expensive is because we have access to credit. Houses, for example, are almost impossible for the average person to pay in cash. We need a mortgage. We do know that whenever the banks move the 30-year fixed interest rate on mortgages, the price of houses instantaneously goes up or down. When they say they're going to cut their rates, the prices of houses goes up. So that actually is the source of the inflation of prices, is how easy or how cheap credit is.
So, I mean, in the economy, sometimes things are interconnected in the sense of, like, somebody might argue, well, the stuff that goes into building the house, paying the workers, all the different pieces that go into that. I mean, those people all need to get paid. And with inflation, all those people's lives are more expensive, which means they need to keep making more money, aka the building of that house continues to rise as well. So it sounds like the interconnectedness of this single piece sends down a ripple effect that passes all the way through the economy. Is that correct to say?
Absolutely. That's well summarized. Because we know prices are going to go up, there is an incentive to take a loan so that you can have it now, right? Mm-hmm. You better buy it now when it's cheaper, because tomorrow it's going to be more expensive. You can't afford it now, so you take a loan. When you take the loan, you are now adding to inflation in a very tiny way, right? Because, you take $1 million loan and you have a, several $1 trillion GDP or more than that, nothing is going to change that much. But if a lot of people are doing it, it will change. So when you take the loan, you are now contributing to inflation. When you contribute to the inflationary, to the prices going up, inflation in other words, there's now more incentive to take loans. It's a vicious cycle. Yeah. And so that's why it's important to really understand what's going on before we can start thinking about a solution. So this is a graph of money supply versus inflation. There are two lines here. There are two plots. One is in red. One is in black. The red line is the inflation rate. The black line is M2 money supply, which is one way of measuring how much money is in the system. What I want to bring your attention to is the following. If you go back to a time before 1913, before the creation of the Federal Reserve, Look at how the inflation rate was all over the place. It was going crazy up, crazy down, crazy up, crazy down. Notice how many times the red line prior to 1913 went below zero. It was frequent. It was regular, right? This is really interesting because when the red line or inflation rate is below zero, that means there's a deflationary cycle. In other words, prices are going down. Things are going to cost less tomorrow. In that situation, there is almost no incentive to buy today, right? Why would you buy something today if it's going to be cheaper tomorrow? So that takes away a great deal of movement towards credit or taking loans. After 1913, notice how infrequent the red line goes below zero. It stays above zero. This is what is commonly and openly and transparently told to us by the central banks. Their intent is to keep the inflation rate not at zero, not at -1, but at 2%. 2% is the sweet spot. To them, that is a sign, and this is what they've been telling us for year after year after year, is like in order to be in a productive economy and one that is beneficial for all, inflation needs to be at 2%. Obviously, it shouldn't be at 20% because, your money's not going to be worth anything, and, you'll have to go shopping at the grocery store with a wheelbarrow full of money. We've seen that happen in some countries. But if it's too low, people won't want to take loans. So they found that that is actually what keeps the system going. The system that they're talking about going, this is the treadmill. This is where it's so difficult to get off because we need to stay, we need credit to buy our stuff. By taking credit, we are contributing to inflation. Now, let us go to the most current part of this graph. Look at what is happening in the year 2020. The black line again is the monetary supply. The red line is inflation. Do you see what's going on there? The black line is like skyrocketing. The red line is still low. The monetary supply is ballooning, but we haven't seen a increase in prices. Why is that? The only explanation for this, and we can see this in our own lives, is that the money is not ending up in the pockets of people who will spend it. It's going someplace else, and I think we know where it's going, right? Like that's what's in the headlines right now. It's going to BlackRock. It's going to Jeff Bezos. It's going to It's going to Amazon. It's going to large corporations that are getting bailouts. The people, we're still fighting for minimum wage that's reasonable, like a way to survive. That's what's happening, and that is the problem that we're having right now.
Yeah, it seems as though at the end of the day with this system and the way it functions, the banks win, the bankers win, the people that support the banks win, but the average citizen doesn't. And yet what's interesting, and this is why this segment's so important, is we're looking at how do we fix the economy? What do we do? How do we raise minimum wage? How do we create more jobs? It's like that's a discussion that's happening inside this sort of narrow-minded, broken system. And I shouldn't even say broken. I mean, it works exactly as it's designed. It just doesn't allow people to thrive, right? So, here we are having this inside-the-box conversation when in reality, when we start seeing what the problem is, we can start saying, well, we have to think outside the box. We have to come together. We have to start talking about new ways of moving forward, new solutions, as opposed to just joining the fabricated sort of political conversation that's going on out there, which is just having everybody fight over these small details that keep this system running.
Absolutely correct. And here, as we close out this segment, because we're not focused in on increasing minimum wage, that does not mean that I don't believe in giving people a living wage. Okay, we're trying to look at the bigger picture. Yeah. So stay on board, and as you pointed out, these meager relief checks, right? They went to people who had to pay rent, so that their landlords could pay their mortgage. In the end, the money always ends up with the banks.
Yeah.
That's how it's been for centuries. The problem that we have, the place where it's broken, is that we're able to generate money from nothing. Mm-hmm. This is the key point, and this is the crux of the problem, is as long as we have a system that allows us to generate money without having anything to back it, we're always going to be on the treadmill. And this is where we should be looking if we want to solve things in a bigger systematic way.
Yeah, agreed. And I would argue, just for the sake of it, that it's also broken in the standpoint that we as people seem to believe that it's set up for our own good, and that this is the only way that it has to be. And of course, it's not. Thanks again for such a great episode of the Setty Report. I'm sure there's going to be more of this coming up in the coming weeks.
Joe, welcome to my house here at the Setty Report. And thank you, everybody, for sticking around and getting through this rather prosaic stuff. But that's where you got to go if you want to thrive and you want to survive.